So all the numbers have particular relationships with each other naturally. And so the way that God set everything into motion can be understood through the spirit of the number 9. That will help you understand how you approach God. Because like every number, 9 also has a virtue or a sin. Just like 0 doesn't have a number, right? But it's your choice. That's your ego. So the 0 isn't necessarily the same as the spirit, but it's very similar in that you choose, but it's how you choose. And 9 is how you approach God. So 9 will bring out the fruits of that choice amongst like your position, where you can mimic the 9, but the 9 itself will function as how you function with God, in the sense that how you relate with the numbers. The number 1, for example, is cooperative with the number 3 and the number 7. It has a natural growth factor with those numbers. So when you meet them, hey, you'll grow. You'll either grow, you go through with humility, or you grow with the structure. But it is a rival to the number 2. So naturally, you're going to be in a rivalry whenever 1 is around 2, whenever fire is around water. There's always going to be a rivalry where 1 is going to try to show its superiority over the other. But when you go back to the number 9, the 9 will denote the relationships between these numbers, whether it's within you or others. 9 is all about how everything not necessarily harmonizes together, but how everything is meant to exist for one complete reality. Harmony, denoted in number 2, does play a part in that, but the spirit of completion is all about everything and how it exists within everything. And it's very similar to harmony, though it's more about how that 1 number, let's say we start at number 1, can flourish in and of itself. So if the 1 wants to improve, clearly it wants to grow. That means it's going to want to meet 7 or 3. Either of those will help it grow, because it will not necessarily balance, but bring out what it needs to expand. But it's not always, that's not how life is. And God made everything with a purpose, but it's not just about ignoring the purpose and just because it's not what you would consider ideal. But true idealism makes it to where you have a way with everything. So sometimes 1 is around 2 instead of 3 or 7, but 2 is also grows from 3 or 7. So even though these 2 are rivals, what the 9 teaches is you want to, when you meet a rival, the goal is to learn how to respect it in a way that it didn't realize that it could grow. And that's actually in a commonality, in a way, an unknown commonality that serves both of them. And that would be in the way that the 2 grows with the 7, or the way that the 2 grows with the 3. So the interesting thing is the thing that might make them rival each other, because they both grow from the same co-pilot, is also how they can both utilize that co-pilot and how they relate to it. Because what they both also have in common is it's not necessarily natural for them to, with their affinity, to want to utilize the 3 or the 7. But what they can do is understand, oh, so that's how you do it. I like how you did that. That really helps the way that you organize that. And then what do you know? They can also help the others. So they can get a pearl of wisdom in a way for how they can both do their thing. And so instead of competing and in a way, standing in each other's way of shining, they can actually bump up to cooperation, which means the one is now able to buffer from the two a way to connect to the three or the seven. So, and that is noted from a nine when the nine is being virtuous, because the virtuousness of one is patience, which leads to success. It connects, but in the sin of one where you disconnect, it'll be from wrath. So you don't summon up enough, you summon up too much fire, or let's say you're just dispassionate, you're not summoning up any fire. It's the same result of disconnection when you burn out, or when you either don't put up enough fire or you can't put up enough fire. It's the same result of disconnection from the sin. So the same with the nine is the virtue of nine will be through faith. So as long as you have that faith when you connect to the path of how the nine interacts in you could say your relationship or your interaction with life, then anything in life, then you can grow. But just like every other number, the nine also has its sin of dogma, where it tries to deify its own way. So if with your ego being zero doesn't really have, it has a virtue or sin, but it doesn't really have a particular virtue or sin. It's literally just virtue or sin, which will play out depending on the numbers you're working with. But in how you're working with those numbers of the dogma might say, well, you know what? I don't need to care about that. I'm only going to work with mine. And that is what I notice is the nine won't necessarily lead to a particular sin with its dogma. What it would bring out is the rivalry could actually form, instead of evolving into a friendship through the faith, which the one is able to connect to the three or the seven. When it meets the two, it could lead to the one and the two not only just having a rivalry, but then that going down into a combativeness in which one combats four. And the thing about 1 and 4 is that they complete each other, but they're opposite. And and that's the relationship of that combat is, well, they're both so insecure about what the other one can do. They don't feel like they can get any better, because the more that one goes in its growth, the harder time it has with 4. Which is also counterintuitive, because it can work with as 4, but the more we're focused on our root chakra, it's just naturally gonna not focus on the heart chakra. But you can grow from the heart chakra, but you have to allow room for it to show. We don't allow ourselves to have a place in our life with the heart chakra. We're so focused on the heart chakra, then, that's because we're going in that one direction. And to notice that we're not allowing ourselves to balance, which balances greatly from one balances greatly from, well, I'm forgetting the number. I think it was 1 balances from 8. Yeah, from 8. So going back between combat, the way that 1 and 4 will combat each other because of their insecurity, dogma breeds forth that frustration and that insecurity. So where instead of focusing on the faith that, hey, you work with this, you can find a way. The dogma will be like, well, hey, I am the way. I don't need to work with that. And then that relationship between the 1 and the 2 can become that rivalry can come down to where either the one beats the two in the rivalry, and now it loses respect for what it could learn from the two, and the two just sits up under it, and the two gets resentful, and then wants to bring down the one, and it ends up having that relationship. Instead of learning from the two, it ends up fighting with the two, and it's really a nasty fight, because when one fights with four, it doesn't have to necessarily be nasty, because they're already used to knowing that they're not as good as the other one at what they do. And they can undermine the other one and say, well, who needs to be authentic? When I have this a bit, like a one can undermine the four and be like, who needs your strength? Like when you can't really do anything. And that's how the four can be thinking about itself. But then the four can talk about, well, who wants to be sitting there and accomplishing all this stuff and you don't even know how you feel? You don't even really know what's true to yourself. So, good morning. When you're dealing with that they both just pull each other down. They don't really help each other. But in reality, they could both be learning so much from each other and how to grow. But, you need that process. So, same thing can happen, but on a more vicious level, when there's dogma involved instead of the faith response, where the one and the two can actually do a lot of harm to each other. I mean, mentioning the one and the four again, the one and the four, they're naturally combative with each other, but they're kind of dangerous for each other because they work on a weakness, but they're also both very formidable with each other. So at most they can just bring each other down, but they already know to be careful with each other. So there's a natural inborn respect there where, hey, they fight, but it's like, we don't need to take it like so far, go so crazy, because we already know like this could really go bad for both of us. But when you have the one and the two, if they were to fall into that kind of relationship, like they could really take each other out. Like, so rivalries that fall into combat have the greatest potential for the most I'd say the most self-destruction. I believe. Because yeah, 1 and 4 can complete each other, and yes, 1 and 4 can. But I feel like it's more likely to happen when the 1 and the 2 fall into that category. Because let's say 1 is fire, 2 is water. Like, what do they do to each other? Fire can definitely cause water to burn out. Water can just completely drop the fire, and then you don't really have either one anymore. It's like they're completely gone. Fire is this smoldering, whatever it was burning on, it's gone. The water is completely evaporated into the air. It's like you're left with earth and air or something. And which is funny, because being left with earth and air are exactly what the 2 goes to 4 for cooperation, and the 1, well, not cooperation, supplication. They get supply from each other. So if you have a rivalry turn into combat, it feels more like war, where they're not fighting fair. They're all about, hey, we can completely take each other out, and if this has to be done, well, we're gonna go get these little allies. But the thing is, they're not growing, because 2 doesn't really grow with 4. It grows with, you gotta remember, 1 and 2 both grow from 3 and 7, but neither one is using what they can to grow. So they're getting their supplies. So 1 gets his supply from 5, fire's gonna get its thing from the wind, 2's gonna get a supply from the 4, which water gets a supply from the earth. And it's funny, because then they come back into that rivalry, into that combat, and that's the thing is, 2 gets a supply from 4, which is originally what 1 would naturally combat with 4 from. So they both get their supply against each other, and isn't it funny that that's what's left? the earth and the wind. When the water and the fire fall into combat and basically wipe each other out, they're left with where they got their supply from. The air and the earth. The smoldering earth, where the fire used to be, and the winds.
How can that be prevented?
So that through faith.
Through faith.
Through following dogma. Because that's the thing about the spirit. Spirit is your relationship with God. You can call God the Great Spirit, but because all life is God, you gotta remember, you could act like God created things outside of himself because here's the ego that God created. But in reality, the ego only exists because it borrows from the spirit. So it wouldn't exist without the choice of how it connects to God. So we're basically borrowing from God in our relationship. So just remembering the 9 is how we utilize the gift of life, which is everything and how it relates with each other. We have a choice of it, and that choice comes back to the 9. So the 9 not only represents your higher self, but also represents lower selves. And you could act like the higher, because the higher self does eventually end up at God, but the lower self eventually ends up at like these things that must be denied, like the self-destructive, the enemy and all that. But you could also deny that as even being the lower self because it is just self-destructive. However, other way you see it, you're dealing with bad spirits. You're dealing with like lower entities that some can learn from you and some are just on the route to self-destruction. So the demonic and the other ones I don't even like to mention. Like the demonic at least has a choice of correction. It's a lot of energy to be tamed, but the enemy's energy will never be tamed into something useful. It is just self-destructive, and the only thing that you can learn from it is balance and to head into the other direction. That's it. And speaking of balance, numbers also have their balance. 1 balances from 8. So what balance teaches you is, hey, it is it's comfortable. It's comfortable. You're very comfortable when you're dealing with a number, dealing with its balance. But that comfort is really just meant for like a short time. That short time can be fun, it can be interesting, but it allows you to go back into your growth. But it's how you handle your fear. There's a reason why you fear it. You fear it because it can be very bad for you. But when you're dealing with, good morning, that energy of, okay, any fear you have is gonna show up in the way of your growth. 1 connects to 3 or 7 to grow. And depending on what you were born to learn from, that would denote which one you should go with. Like if you're an intuitive business person, you gotta go with 7. If you're more of a grounded, sensory business person, you gotta go with 3. 3 is about structure, limitation, standing the test of time. 7 is about intuition, diving deep, connecting and creating from these visions of the box. Not necessarily outside the box, you're really about the box. You gotta understand that inner matrix. That's 7. Either way, they pair perfectly with the ability to organize everything externally, logically, to the 1. 8 though is all about that physical energy. And the thing is, 1 and 8 balance greatly together. Also, the 1 and the 6 balance greatly together. But the thing about that balance is it's very comfortable. It's very comfortable for a 1 to be around like the 6 energy or the 8 energy and feel like, hey, it knows it. But the thing is, it can have fun in that energy because they're both extroverted. Like 6 and 8 are both extroverted. They're free in the realm where the one is usually being strict. It can let loose a little bit and have some fun, but it's really short-lived, because after a while it can think it's really good at that energy, but it's really not. But it can sometimes teach you the right thing, and that's why balance can also bring forth deception. And that's the trick. Like, a lot of people are so comfortable in their insecurities that they can fool themselves into thinking they're very talented at what they do. And that's the problem with that, is that's the deception. In reality, you should be heading in that growth state. Like, the business person might think themselves an amazing athlete because they can put all this fire into all this physical activity, or they can put all this fire into all this like creativity, like a MacGyver, if you will. And yeah, on a game level, like on a fun level, because in a short burst like that, yeah, that can come off in a very interesting way. Because you can't forget, sometimes, like, say, kids say the darndest things. Like that 10-year-old process can really show some interesting results with that driver. But when you really amp that out to a higher level, it's really only on that 10-year-old level. So when it's going to work on a level where it's growing, you'll find that, well, the information is off. It doesn't really work. The results don't really work. And so it can really just be deceiving. And that's honestly a real enemy right there. That's a real enemy right there. Like, that deception will keep something stunted and can also, in a way, lead it to its own, I could say it could even lead it to its own downfall. And the way I'd have to imagine that would be if the one stays in comfort with, let's say, really the 8 or the 6, then it might come back with this notion like, yeah, like I can make whatever I want to happen with myself, or I can take charge of any outcome and MacGyver my solution. Then it could end up like not only with this false sense of power, but it also requires tricking other things, because it itself is not working at that higher level. So in a way, it's like breaking its own rules, or it's coming in areas where, again, it's a game, right? So it requires something else to fall for it. And that's the thing about fun and games. Like, they're not inherently evil until you put very serious consequences on them. And that's basically when people give their whole life into very insignificant things in a way that deifies it. So, yeah, that's very evil. And what I imagine can happen with that is the one ends up dealing with this kind of false sense of strength. And then, what would I imagine? Like, if the one is with the 2, and then the rivalry turns into a combat, and then the 2 goes and gets the 4 while the 1 gets the 5. Then the 1 got the 5, and now it has its supply, which supplication itself doesn't, it makes things comfortable, but it doesn't necessarily help it to what it would need. I mean, it's good to have something help you every now and then, where you can get a little bit of feedback. I think it's a bit of a refresher. It's a bit of a refresher for sure. And then you can keep going, and it's in a way like something nice in life. It's something nice in life, but it could spoil us. It could spoil us, and that's not what it's about. But in the same time, when you get this spoil energy goes towards this other spoil energy, and they take each other out, then we end up with this result. We're gonna turn around, where okay, neither one is left, but how that relates with the 8 or the 6 energy is the same number that spoils the 1 and the 2. Like the 2 gets it from the 4, that pairs perfectly with the 6 or the 8 as a cooperative thing. And same with the 1 getting it from the 5. Also, the 5 also pairs greatly with the 6 or the 8. And the funny thing is, when the 1 gets that supply from the 5 and the 4 also rival each other. But I think the reason why the 5 and the 4 are left in the fight between the 1 and the 2, that they're helping, is because even though they're not really fighting each other, the air, the water and the fire are fighting each other. The 1 and 2 are fighting each other, but the 5 and the 4, they were just supplying. They weren't necessarily directly involved in the confrontation because they're still rivals. But now I'm thinking about how the 1, once it gets it from the 4, or the 2 once it gets it from the 5, how they both work with the things that can balance them. It's like, I imagine if it got even lower than that, because what's left is the 5 and the 4. I'm not exactly sure. That's actually, it's an interesting thought exercise and what that would be. But following the train of it, I would imagine my intuition is telling me somehow that balancing, like if the 1 had that cockiness with that balance thing, if it just lived like that, I just imagine it's like a person living in so much comfort when they're deceived in their own right.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it just doesn't function as highly as it could, and it takes away from other things, and it probably loses a lot. But then if it ever won, it wins where it doesn't matter, and it would probably just lead to a lot of extra frustration with other parts of life, and it will probably just it'll probably just have to end up going, and that's probably the overall issue. I mean, 1, they take each other out, but other things are left. This other one, I feel like the deceived from the comfort, living a life of comfort, it probably becomes more disease and ends up just basically taken away from everything else around it. And it probably creates a larger problem in some way. So I think about it, I mean, it ultimately is just a game taken seriously. And I mean, what else could really be more deceptive than that? I mean, that's probably in its sense what deception is really just a game. Something that's really just meant for entertainment, taken at serious value, which is a false creation. A false creation being treated as a creation in itself. And if it's given that much attention, then you basically have a false god, an idol. And that's ultimately what dogma is about. Dogma is ultimately about deifying yourself. Faith is about deifying God, the true God. In fact, faith and worship, it's dead without action. So true faith, true worship is an action of following, how you live your life. Every choice you make in your life geared towards God. But in dogma, when you make yourself God and you follow that self-destructive part, that's the deception, is that this lower part of yourself is even yourself to begin with, when in reality there's this whole light. So it's funny how it's hidden in something like a comfort. But supplication, so I guess in a sense, since supplication supplies help, they can help keep something a little motivated. So when you're dealing with an energy that gets spoiled a little bit, it's just time to use that fuel. And just use that fuel, keep going. Just take it and go, accept it and go. Don't just keep siphoning off from it, because it's really just gonna wear it down. And apparently when one gets its not energy, but supply from 5, then it's like all powerful, like glowing. It's not it's not really growing though. Like it needs something to put a higher use for it. And I can't say it would blow itself out, but it could be that it's not balanced enough or not balanced, probably isn't the best word for it. I would say what you learn from rivalry is that I like how it said Jesus right there.
Yes.
I like how when we're dealing with every aspect of life, the truth is God created everything to where it can serve this higher purpose. And yes, there are ideal circumstances where you get your higher purpose, but you're not always paired with them, because everything else also exists. And to have everything just separated and say, well, yeah, this is how we make it, is we got to separate. Like, yeah, there are things where there's a limit, though. You do need a limit. But to completely say, hey, they don't deserve to exist is a lie. And to say, well, they don't deserve to exist next to each other, that's closer to the truth. But it will be more that you get enough, and then you go to where you're supposed to go. But everything else also has other relationships with other things. So if we just kept everything on the natural cooperative level, that would actually lead to a stagnation, because the one can't just exist with the 6 and the 3 and then, hey, it's growing. But what about our rival, the 2? Shouldn't the 2, like, if they're gonna say the 2 shouldn't grow, then how are you gonna have a full environment? We have water right here with the earth. We have fire in people's homes, on the earth. Like, we got the wind. Everything is a whole system. If the thing is, the fire and the 2, you might say, well, keep them separate then. Keep the fire growing with the 7 and the 3. But the 2 grows with the 7 and the 3. So they're gonna, at some point, they share the same growth direction. So you could say we can separate you, but you got to remember the 7 and the 3 also grow with the 2. And they're not only going to grow with the 1, they're going to grow in other areas. And how can you call yourself someone's friend if you're going to cut them off from other potential growth factors in their life. You can't. It would only be a one-sided growth by that point, which will probably be shown through the supplication. Like, the supplication is like, okay, 1 and the 5, right? Well, the thing is, 5 is helping the 1, so the 1 is like, yeah, I'm growing, or the 5 is like, yeah, I'm so powerful, but only powerful in its own, it's like its own acceptance of self. But the thing is, the 1 and the 5 grow through different circumstances. The 5 grows with the 6 or the 8, and the 6 or the 8, they balance out the 1. So it's like if you just had a world where it was the 1 and the 3 or the 7, like the 1, the 7, and the 3, and then the 5, the 8, and the 6, and then there's no 2, right? It's like 1 is like, well, we're just going to get rid of the rival, because we're just going to get rid of the 2 and the 4, because apparently it's like the 2 and the 4, it's like, what does it need them for? What does it need the 2 and the 4 for if you have the 3, the 7, the 6, the 8? You basically have everything except for the rival. The rival and the combatant. And that would seem like a pretty comfortable life. But the thing is, not only would the 1 be the 1's cooperative energies are missing out on their growth, and not only their growth, but then take out the 4 as well. Like, who does the 4 help? The 6 and the 8, the things that balance out the 1. So the 1 is going to get balanced out. So you're dealing with this deception, you're dealing with this like self-importance, and you're basically dealing with the game that's important. But there's going to also be a point where you're going to have to ask yourself, what are we missing in life that we get from the combat and the rival? And there's a level of respect where, hey, well, what do you know? The 1, even though it burns and it creates so much with connection, it needs that access, it needs that authenticity. Pretty much everything in its opposite does it so it can get to the opposite, but it'll never be able to reach completion because it's so busy barring it away, saying, well, we don't need the 4, we don't need the 2. And it'll eventually show in that growth factor. But that's just, I think it just says enough to say, it's like, if you looked at these numbers also like people, if you're friends with something, but you're ignoring where it needs to grow, but you get what you want from it, eventually you could say you're becoming more like a rival than an actual friend, because you're basically saying, look, I know this helps you, but I don't like it. I don't want it around. So, we're just gonna stay separate from it. But but it's like also saying, hey, it's us. I don't want to be around it, so I don't want you to be around it either. There we go. And eventually, that cooperation, and you got to remember, cooperation can turn into rivalry. Friendships can dissolve into rivalries. And the thing about the rivalries are, they go back and forth between rivalries a lot. A lot. I mean, it's probably even more obvious in male friendships, but the cooperation between the 1 and the 3 or the 7, when it's barring away the other, like the 2, for example, basically the 1 can be so focused on his rivalry with the 2 that if it gets to a level of deception where it chooses, well, we're just going to be separated from the 2, then the 3 and the 7 that are now, okay, well, they're not allowed to be around the 2 because they're associating with them, then what happens is the original cooperation becomes this, it becomes this rivalry where it's like, okay, well, we were helping each other, but now I'm stopping you from getting help from them. So the 3 or the 7 is going to reach out to the 2 just to make sure it can grow. And it's going to do what it can to bypass. So it's basically, rivalry is, hey, cooperation before was you or me, are going to shine over this, and this, it's apparently can't be both of us, so one of us is going to get our way. And now it has to be like that so it can go get its way and grow with the 2. So in a way, rivalry, like when it grows to like a really toxic level of deception, can end up creating another rivalry out of an area where there was cooperation. So the 1 ends up cutting off its own growth in that sense. So it's funny how it all comes full circle, it all comes around, and the only real solution is the proper relation, just following that faith of the proper relationship with all these different energies. And in reality, it's not like we're going to always be, around everything all the time, because you can't. Like, the truth is, you do need to go your own separate way at times. But to stay completely separated at all times is unrealistic as well. So my understanding is just everything work with each other towards the cooperative, the cooperative thing. But then sometimes the cooperative thing has to take a break as well. And then you got to balance, or you got to straight up allow your opposite to flourish a little bit. Relax with it. Like, let 1 relax with 4 sometimes. But also don't overdo that either, because, you got to, like, if 1 has to be expressed, 1 has to go back to it. But sometimes 1 has to just take a break and stop driving and let the 4 relax. Let the 4 relax and do his thing, and then go back to driving. Let the 4 relax before it gets stressed. And that way it can grow. It can grow. It can grow from a fight to a, it can eventually form into like maybe a rivalry, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day a cooperation.